An entity data reader object represents the entities and relationships in the entity data model and supports both scalar properties and complex objects. To use Entity Client, you use Entity SQL for the query expression. The Entity Client code sample that I'm going to show you shows a simple example of directly querying the Entity Client, using the now familiar query to retrieve the customer's named Anne. Programming the Entity Client is generally similar to low-level ADO.NET programming in that you need to create and open a connection, create a command object and set its properties, then execute the query to return a data reader. Then you have to read the data in sequential order as it's streamed from the model and the database. Here's a code example that uses the Entity Client API. As you can see right off the bat, the code is more complex. You just have to do more in code in order to use this technique. Okay, so the code starts by declaring and creating an entity connection object. And it passes in the name of the connection string as it's defined within the app.config file. And that's what was created when the model was created. So this is the full connection string to the model, not just to the underlying database. Now, keep in mind that even with direct querying against Entity Client, you're still querying the entity data model, not the database directly. Okay, so using a using statement so that it's destroyed once I'm done with it, I new up an entity connection and pass in the name of the connection string. And then I open that connection. So if you're familiar with ADO.NET database programming, this should start looking pretty similar already. Okay, then the next part of the code sets up the entity SQL query string in order to retrieve customers who have the first name Anne. All right, so that's just a string object. And then it creates an entity command on that connection and sets the command text to that query. So of course there's nothing magic about creating a string variable here. I could have directly assigned the literal string there. Or I could concatenate together a query string from various pieces of information that's available dynamically at runtime. So lots of options in how it does that. Okay, so once this code executes, the command is now configured and is ready for data access. Next, the code needs to create an entity data reader, which I once again put in a using block so that it's garbage disposed when I'm done using that object. This is the object through which it's going to stream the data from the query results. All right, then I create that entity data reader, and I use the execute reader method in order to create that object. So here's where things get a bit interesting. As you can see, I'm passing two items to the execute reader method. They're both values of the command behavior enumeration. The first is sequential access, and the second is close connection. Like regular ADO.NET, close connection closes the connection as soon as the application has received all of the data. So you don't have to remember to do it and inadvertently keep the connection open and in memory. Now that's typically not too critical. A method is going to end, that object is going to be released, and it should close the connection, but it's better to explicitly specify that. All right, but the other one is sequential access, and this is crucial. Using the sequential access setting, it's required for Entity Client. You'll get a runtime exception if you leave it out. What this does is it tells the objects that the data is going to stream in row by row and field by field within each row. And, most importantly, you have to access it in that order. There's no going back. Okay, then the last section of code actually reads the data using this read method. Again, if you've done a lot of ADO.NET programming, these method names should be pretty familiar. Okay, so this reads the stream of data coming in, and the read method advances to each row, and then the code writes it out to the console. And that's all done within a while loop. So as long as the read method returns true, there's another row of data to process, and so the code within the loop executes. Okay, now here's where things get a little bit tricky. You might try and write code like this. looks innocuous enough. Uses string.format to format a string, reads the company name, first name, and last name fields. Okay, but there's a problem with this. So I'm going to execute this code. I've already set the main method to execute this method. Okay, I get an invalid operation exception, and it was unhandled. I'm not handling any errors within this. Okay, the type is system.invalidOperationException, and it occurred within entityFramework.dll. And the additional information was attempt to read from column ordinal 3 is not valid. With command behavior.sequentialAccess, which is required, so it's not something that we can do optionally, you may only read from column ordinal 8 or greater. Well, that's a little bit strange. I'm just reading the names. Well, the problem is that within the customer table, within the AdventureWorks LT database, the first name and last name fields come before company name. But here I'm trying to read company name first. That's a later field, so I can't go back and get first name. So to make this a little bit clearer, I'll come over to Solution Explorer and open up the designer and look at customer. Hide this and bump it up in size a little bit. So notice that the order of the fields, customer ID, name style, title, first name, middle name, last name, suffix, and company name. Company name is way down here as the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th field. So I'm reading that first. I'm reading company name first, but I've already gone past the first name. And so I can't go back and read first name again. And that's why I got the error that I can only read from ordinal 8. I can't read from ordinal 3 because that data is already streamed by and is gone forever. Okay, so this is actually where that error is occurring, because I'm trying to read this first name field after company name, but it appears first in the stream. Okay, so that's not going to work. I need to stop execution. So now there's a couple different ways to fix that problem. First, I'm going to comment out this code and uncomment this code. Okay. So now what I'm doing is I'm basically rearranging the format string so that I'm going to display the company name first and then the first and last name. But I'm reading them now in the correct order. I'm just changing the order here to display them in the order that I actually want to show them within the console window, the company name first. But the important thing here is that I'm reading first name, then last name, then company name. Go back over to the diagram. I'm reading first name, streams through, reading last name, streams through, and gets to company name. So now I'm reading the data in the order that it's streaming as shown in this list of fields within the customer object. Okay, so I'll go back over here. I'll start and execute that. And now I get that data. In the output, the company name is first, but I read the company name in the correct order, after first name, after last name. Okay, so that's one way to fix it. Comment that out. But then there's another way to fix it. Essentially uses similar kind of a technique. But here what I'm doing is I'm now creating variables that are going to store the information, first name, last name, company. I'm reading them in the correct order, 3, 5, and 7. And there's different ways to read that. Here I'm using the ordinal field values just to make the point. And then I can use these variables in any order that I want, because they're just variables. They're just data points in memory, like any typical variable within a .NET application. Okay, so when I run this, recompiles and runs, and I once again get the results. Okay, so that's something to be very careful of with the Entity Client API.